Hello friends, let us study the factor endowment and Heckscher-Ohlin theory. Today's topic is General Equilibrium Framework of International Trade. Let's begin with introduction. Friends, as you all know, the Swedish economist Elie Heckscher had given a new approach of international trade after World War I. Another Swedish economist, Bertil Ohlin, has developed this approach further and given the modern theory of international trade in his book Interregional and International Trade. This theory is known as Heckscher-Ohlin theory of international trade. They both believe in comparative cost theory. What is the reason of comparative cost and specialization? Why does comparative cost arise? This theory gives the answer to these questions. This theory uses general equilibrium approach. According to Ohlin, international trade is a special case of interregional trade. According to this theory, there are three reasons for difference in production cost of any particular commodity. Number one, demand for commodity. Number two, production system of commodity. And number three, relative ratio of factors of production in a nation. This theory assumes that demand for commodity and production system are constant. Therefore, the main reason for difference in production cost is relative ratio of factors of production. This theory does not substitute Ricardo's theory of international trade. In fact, it supports the Ricardian version of international trade. According to this theory, difference in production cost and ultimately it leads to difference in factor endowments leads to difference in commodity prices. This theory says that the main reason of international trade is difference in factor endowments. Therefore, this theory is also known as factor endowment theory. Differences in commodity prices are due to cost differences which are the result of differences in factor endowments in the two countries. Let's see the assumptions. Number one, there are two countries, two goods and two factors of production. This model is also known as 2 by 2 by 2 model. Number two, there is a perfect competition in goods market, which means that price is determined by the industry and producers and consumers cannot affect the market price. Number three, there is perfect competition in factor market, which means that neither labor nor capital has the power to affect prices or factor rewards. Number four, there is full employment in both nations. Number five, there is constant return to scale. It exhibits that doubling the inputs, that is labor and capital, output will increase by twofold. We can say that production function is homogeneous of degree 1. If we double the amount of labor and keep capital constant, output will increase less than the increase in the amount of labor. It shows the diminishing returns to labor. Similarly, there is diminishing returns to capital also. Number six, we can know the abundance of goods. One cannot change the abundance of goods. Number seven, there is free trade between two nations. There are no restrictions like tariffs, quota, etc. Number eight, the factors of production are completely mobile within the nation, but they cannot move from one nation to another. Therefore, international mobility does not exist. We can say that one labor can move from Mumbai to Ahmedabad, but he or she cannot move from Mumbai to New York. Number nine, the production function of two goods is different, but they are same in both nations. It means that production function of good X is same in both nations and production function of good Y is same in both nations. But production function of X and Y are different in both nations. Number 10, factors affecting demand like taste, preferences and income are assumed to be constant. Number 11, the stock of the factors of production in both nations is constant. They are homogeneous. According to this theory, difference in supply of factors of production leads to difference in factor endowments. This results in difference in price of goods and which in fact results in imports and exports of goods. It says that the main reason for international trade is the difference in factor endowments because of difference in supply of factors of production. Let's understand the theory. A nation exports goods which use relatively greater proportion of its relatively abundant and thus cheap factors of production, and imports goods which use relatively greater proportion of its relatively scarce and thus expensive factor of production. It means that a nation will export the commodity whose production requires the intensive use of nation's relatively abundant factor and import the commodity whose production requires intensive use of nation's relatively scarce factor. In other words, capital rich nation exports capital intensive commodity and imports labor intensive commodity. Similarly, labor rich nation exports labor intensive commodity and imports capital intensive commodity. Example, let us assume two nations A and B and two commodity X and Y. Nation A is capital abundant and nation B is labor abundant nation. This means that nation A has relatively more supply of capital than labor and nation B has relatively more supply of labor than capital. The production of X requires more capital and less labor. It means that commodity X is capital intensive. Similarly, production of Y requires more labor and less capital, hence commodity Y is labor intensive. That is, good X is capital intensive if capital labor ratio, that is K by L, used in the production of good X is greater than K by L ratio used in the production of good Y. For example, if 4 units of capital and 4 units of labor are required to produce 1 unit of X in nation A, therefore, K by L ratio is equal to 4 by 4, that is 1. If production of good Y requires 2 units of capital and 4 units of labor, then K by L ratio is equal to 2 by 4, that is equal to 1 by 2 in nation A. Here, K by L ratio of X is greater than the K by L ratio of Y. Hence, commodity X is capital intensive and commodity Y is labor intensive. The above example shows that absolute amount of capital in labor used in the production of good is not important to decide the intensity of goods, but the amount of capital relative to labor, that is KL ratio, is important. The figure shows that nation A can produce 1x with 4 units of capital and 4 units of labor. We can say that the nation A can produce 2x with 8 units of capital and 8 units of labor. Thus, the KL ratio, that is 8 by 8, is equal to 4 by 4, that is 1. This is given by the slope of 1 from the ray from the origin for commodity X. Nation A requires 2 units of capital and 4 units of labor to produce 1 Y. Therefore, 4 units of capital and 8 units of labor are required to produce 2 Y. Thus, KL ratio in Y is equal to 2 by 4, that is 4 by 8, which results to 1 by 2. This is given by the slope of 1 by 2 for the ray from the origin for commodity Y. It is important to note that the ray from the origin of commodity X is steeper than the ray of commodity Y. It means that the slope of ray for the commodity X is higher than the slope of the ray for commodity Y. Therefore, we can say that commodity X is capital intensive and commodity Y is labor intensive in nation A. Now assume that if 4 units of capital and 2 units of labor are required to produce 1 unit of X in nation B, therefore, KL ratio is equal to 4 by 2 is equal to 2. If production of commodity Y requires 4 units of capital and 4 units of labor, then KL ratio is equal to 4 by 4, that is 1 in nation B. Here, K/L ratio of X is greater than KL of Y, hence commodity X is capital intensive and commodity Y is labor intensive. This is clear from the figure. Now, it is important to note that the ray from the origin for commodity X is steeper than the ray for commodity Y. It means that the slope of the ray for commodity X is higher than the slope of the ray for commodity Y. Therefore, we can say that commodity X is capital intensive and commodity Y is labor intensive in nation B. Commodity X and commodity Y are capital and labor intensive respectively in both nations. Let's discuss the factor abundance and production possibility frontier. We can define factor abundance in two ways. Number one, in terms of physical units, and number two, in terms of relative factor price. According to the definition of physical units, nation A is capital abundant if the ratio of total amount of capital to the total amount of labor, that is Tk by Tl, available in nation A is greater than that of nation B. Therefore, Tka upon Tla is greater than Tkb upon Tlb. It means that the relative amount of capital in nation A greater than that of nation B. Similarly, the relative amount of labor is greater than in nation B than that of nation A. According to the definition of relative factor price, nation A is capital abundant if the ratio of the interest rate, that is price of capital, to wage rate, that is price of labor, is lower than that of nation B. Therefore, Pk by Pl of nation A is less than Pk by Pl of nation B, that is equal to R by W of A is less than R by W of B, where R stands for rate of interest and W stands for wage rate. The reason for this is nation A has relatively more capital than labor and hence capital is relatively cheaper than labor in nation A. Similarly, nation B has relatively more labor than capital and hence labor is relatively cheaper than capital in nation B. Therefore, we can say that nation A is capital abundant nation and nation B is labor abundant nation. Production possibility frontier. A production possibility frontier, that is PPF, is locus which shows the combinations of two or more goods that can be produced by using given factors of production. In our example, nation A is capital abundant nation and commodity X is capital intensive commodity. Nation B is labor abundant and commodity Y is labor intensive commodity. Therefore, nation A can produce more of commodity X and nation B can produce more of commodity Y. This gives the PPF of nation A and nation B. Consider the following figure. According to the figure, commodity X is measured on X axis and commodity Y is measured on Y axis. Number 1. Nation A can produce more of commodity X and less of commodity Y because nation A is capital abundant nation and commodity X is capital intensive. Nation A can produce maximum OS amount of X and maximum OR amount of Y. Therefore, OS is greater than OR. Number 2. Nation B can produce more of commodity Y and less of commodity X because nation B is a labor abundant nation and commodity Y is labor intensive. Nation B can produce maximum OP amount of Y and maximum OQ amount of X. Therefore, OP is greater than OQ. Number 3. PPF of nation A is flatter and wider than PPF of nation B. It indicates that nation A can produce relatively more of commodity X and nation B can produce relatively more of commodity Y. Let us study the general equilibrium framework of Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. The general equilibrium framework of the WHO theorem can be summarized with the use of the following figure. The factor price is determined by the supply and demand of factors. We need factors of production to produce commodity. It means that the demand of factors of production is the result of demand for commodities. The price of factor of production and technology determines the price of the final commodity. The price of factors of production is different and hence the price of commodity is different. The difference in relative commodity prices among nations then determines comparative advantage and the pattern of trade. Consider the figure. This figure shows the production frontier of nation A and nation B. According to our example, nation A is capital abundant and commodity X is capital intensive. Hence, nation A can produce more of commodity X. Nation B is labor abundant and commodity Y is labor intensive. Hence, nation B can produce more of commodity Y. We assume that two nations have equal taste. Therefore, both nations face same indifference map. IC1 is common for both the nation, is tangent to nation A's PPF at point A and nation B's PPF at point B. Both nations can reach IC1 in isolation. It means that point A and B exhibit their equilibrium points of production and consumption in the absence of trade. The relative commodity price is PA in nation A and PB in nation B. Since PA is less than PB, nation A has comparative advantage in commodity X and nation B has comparative advantage in commodity Y. Another figure shows that nation A specializes in commodity X and nation B specializes in commodity Y. Specialization in production will continue until nation A has reached point P and nation B has reached point P1. At point P and P1, PPFs of two nations are tangent to a common relative price line PL. Nation A will export commodity X and in exchange for commodity Y and consume at point E on IC2. Trade triangle is PCE. Nation B will export commodity Y and in exchange for commodity X and consume at point E1 on IC2. That is, E1 is equal to E. Trade triangle is P1, C1, E1. Nation A's export of commodity X equals to nation B's import of commodity X. That is, PC is equal to E1, C1. Similarly, nation B's export of commodity Y equals to nation A's import of commodity Y. That is, P1, C1 is equal to CE. Both nations gain from trade because they consume on higher indifference curve. Let's summarize. Heckscher and Ohlin have given the modern version of international trade theory with the help of general equilibrium approach. According to this theorem, a nation will export the commodity whose production requires the intensive use of nation's relatively abundant factor and import the commodity whose production requires intensive use of nation's relatively scarce factor. In other words, capital rich nation exports capital intensive commodity and import labor intensive commodity. Similarly, labor rich nation exports labor intensive commodity and import capital intensive commodity. Thank you.